Good morning. Welcome to Creeks Inn today. It's good to see you. Believe it or not, Thanksgiving's here, isn't it? Wow. And then Christmas. It's coming. We're finishing up a series today called Monsters. So we're glad you joined us. If you're watching online on our live stream, we're glad you joined us as well. And we've talked about three spiritual monsters so far, if you've been with us. The monster of spiritual indifference. We talked about how that robs us of our intimacy with God, and it literally makes God sick when we are indifferent toward what he's given us. And then the second week, we talked about the monster of hollow worship. And boy, we had some great worship this morning, didn't we? But hollow worship robs God of the praise and honor that he deserves. And then last week, one of the toughest ones to deal with is the monster of hypocrisy, because it's so easy to see it in others, but hard to see in ourselves. And we said that hypocrisy was the gap between what we show and who we really are. And the only way we can fill that gap is not with trying to be perfect, but with Christ. That's the only thing that can fill that gap to make us real. And we have to drop the mask and be authentic. So today we're going to tackle the last one of spiritual pride. And to introduce it, I want to tell a little story. Back in the 90s, when I was a worship leader and writing songs and singing songs, there was this Christian artist seminar that took place in Estes Park, Colorado, every year. And I'd been wanting to go for years, and I decided that I was going to go. And what they did was that they had seminars and stuff for musicians and actors and writers, and they would have competitions, vocal competition, instrumental competitions, group competitions, and if you win, there's these recording packages and all kinds of stuff, or you get your song published or whatever. So I decided I was going to go one year, and I did, and I competed vocally in songwriting, but this story is actually not about me. It's about a friend that went with me, and just to protect the innocent, I'm going to call him Fred, okay? Fred. Now, Scott, Sean, y'all are going to appreciate this. Ian. Fred, no, Sean's not his name. Fred played the guitar. He played in our worship band. He was a pretty good guitar player. But the problem was he wasn't as good as he thought he was. And if he had one character flaw, bless his heart, it was that he thought that he was God's gifted guitarist to the world. But he said, I don't want to go with you. I want to compete in that thing. I think I can win it. And I said, well, sure, man, we'll go up and have a good time together. And so we did. And there is that noise again. Wow. You caught it, though, Chris. Good job. So we went, and I competed in my things, and Fred competed in the instrumental. And I remember going over, though, and I was catching the semifinals of Fred's competition, which happened to be with other string players. Now, there are all kinds of players that come into this competition, and they have to divide it into different things, and his was the string because he played guitar. So you had banjos, you had violins and cellos, and there was one guy there who competed on what, and you may not even know what this is, but it was called a hammered dulcimer, okay? Now, you may know what a dulcimer is because it's a thing you play like this, but the hammered dulcimer sits flat, and you play it with little hammers, okay? So I'm watching this competition, and this hammered dulcimer guy gets up, and he plays a song, and I just have to be honest, it was the most boring song and performance that I had ever seen. And I thought, well, gosh, even Fred can beat this, So Fred and this guy both made the finals. And so they don't make the announcement until the very last night when they have a big concert and everyone gathers around and they announce the winners of the competition. Hang with me, that noise is back again. So we're gonna try to, I saw Jerry go back there and try to figure it out. But anyway, it's time to announce the winners of the instrumental competition. And so they're ready to announce the winner of the string part of it. And Fred is ready. I think he's probably already written his speech, And so they win it, and the guy says, and the winner of the string number competition is blah, 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 blah on hammered dulcimer. And I went, you gotta be kidding me. But I was not the only one feeling bad, but Fred just sunk in his seat. And all he could think of on the way home was, I got beat by a hammered dulcimer. And to this day, years later, every time we're together, I said, yeah, you got beat by a hammered dulcimer, right? But it was probably a very humbling experience for him because that was a little flaw that he had in his life, and it was a kind of a pride kind of issue that he had that maybe God was dealing with him with, and that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. If you have a Bible, I want you to turn to Luke chapter 18. If you don't have a Bible, there's one in front of you in the pew. You can read along, or you can read along on the screen, and of course the verses are in your notes as well. But here's what we're going to be talking about today. Spiritual pride is seeing ourselves as a gift to God rather than a gift from God. See, that was Fred's problem. He saw himself as a gift to God rather than a gift from God. It's a misplaced sense of worth or value about ourselves, that we are right before God and others aren't. When we go to church and we look down on others who don't go to church, that's spiritual pride. When we are confident in our own righteousness and we look down at others' unrighteousness, what we would call, then we are full of spiritual pride. And it's a dangerous thing because you remember in Proverbs, what does it say about pride? Pride goes before what? A fall. You know, the proud will go down eventually. Spiritual pride is a monster. Now, evidently, like all the other topics that we've covered, Jesus did not care for spiritual pride. And in Luke 18, he tells us a story about two guys who go to the same place for the same purpose. Two guys, one a Pharisee, a supposed good guy, and the other a tax collector, a bad guy. And they go to the temple, they go to church, the visible presence of God on earth, in order to pray to God. And Jesus tells us what they pray. And then he says that one of those men leaves right before God and the other doesn't. And he uses this to talk about spiritual pride. So we're going to pick up the story in Luke 18, beginning in verse 9. Jesus says, "To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable." And he told this story that was intended not to teach everybody, but to teach people who trusted in themselves, who had faith in themselves. They hoped in themselves. Why? Because it says that they viewed themselves as righteous, and they were very confident in it. I do the right things. I'm right before God. And because they viewed themselves as righteous, it says they viewed others with contempt. Because your relationship with God can't be separated by your relationship with people. The vertical always impacts the horizontal. So Jesus is speaking to a very specific audience. And I would add to that, if the shoe fits, wear it. And then he goes on. Here's what he says. Two men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. So you got a Pharisee, a good guy. He was the respected religious leader in his day. There were 613 laws in the Old Testament. And while I'm very proud of myself for remembering that number, this man knew every single one of them by heart. 613 laws. He was respected in the community. He was kind of like a pastor or a Bible teacher in the church. So you have the Pharisee, who's the good guy, but then you have the tax collector. And if the Pharisee was like a pastor or a Bible teacher, I don't know if there's a modern equivalent for a tax collector. You would probably think, well, that's easy. That's an IRS guy, right? Not necessarily. Same kind of business, but this guy, this tax collector, was even worse. Some of you may have a translation. Your Bible might even say despised tax collector. And he was despised because he didn't just collect taxes for his government. He collected taxes for the Roman Empire. And they had come to conquer his country. And he was helping them fund that empire, an expansion of that empire throughout the world. So this guy that you grew up with is taking your money to fund a government that's occupying your country. But there's more than that. He also took more than was required to make himself wealthy. It was kind of like a corrupt politician who's lining his pockets, or a neighborhood drug dealer who's selling drugs in his neighborhood to get rich. He was the despised tax collector. Well, they go to the temple to talk to God. And here's what happens. We have the good guy and we have the bad guy. And it doesn't matter if you've heard this story before. You've heard this story before. It's like Skywalker and Darth Vader. It's like Jim and Dwight from The Office. It's like Chuck Norris and whatever poor character comes up against Chuck Norris. You've heard the story. You got a good guy and a bad guy. And usually who wins? Usually the good guy. But here's how this story ends. Verse 11, the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed. So the Pharisee kind of stood by himself. He distanced himself from everybody else who was there. And they're there to do the same thing he's doing, to pray. And this is what he says. God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. Verse 12, I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. God, thank you that I do the right things. And thank you that I'm better than anyone else who's around me. And get this, the Pharisee wasn't completely wrong. I mean, he had a lot of good things going for him. By the age of 12, he would have already memorized the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Not just the titles, every single word by the age of 12. So he spent time in God's word. He's tried to do what was right in his life. He had a lot of great things going for him. But instead of seeing those good things going on in his life as a gift from God, he saw himself as a gift to God. Thank God that I'm not like anybody else. And before we look down our nose at the Pharisees, we'd be wise to recognize and acknowledge the Pharisee that resides in all of us. Instead of God, thank you so much that I get to be a part of the church that experiences God every single week. God, it's like this. You're welcome that I made it to church today. Instead of thanking God for those kids that he's given you to raise and teach the precepts of God, it's more like, God, you're welcome. I brought them to church today so you can work on them. See, because we stop seeing the good things in our life as a gift from God, we begin to see ourselves as the gift to God. And we begin to experience this monster of spiritual pride. Now let's stop for just a moment and talk about that for just a minute. Spiritual pride promises us 3 things. And if you're taking notes, write these down. First of all, it promises us self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency. I've got what it takes. I don't need anybody else. Look at what I've accomplished. Look at the good things that I've done. Self-sufficiently. I don't need anybody else. Secondly, it promises us self-importance. I have value. I live in the right neighborhood. I have the right label on the purse that I carry. My kids go to the right school. I have an important job. I have value. I'm in leadership and position in the church. I have value because I'm self-sufficient and because I'm self-important. And when you put those 2 things together, you have the third thing, and that's self-exaltation. Self-exaltation. Everybody look at me. That's what the Pharisee did. He stepped aside, distanced himself, and said, look at me, I'm different than you. And yet, spiritual pride is this inward emotion that leads to an outward action that we would never really want to be associated with normally. I mean, we don't like it in other people, do we? But yet this inward thought becomes an action. And we experience the emotion like the Pharisee, and it leads to action that we wouldn't normally want to be compared with. And we begin to get critical, and we get harsh in our spirit, and we begin to look at other people and say things like this. Would you look at what that lady's wearing? I can't believe what she's wearing. Can you believe nobody talked to her before she got to church this morning to tell her that just doesn't work? And that stuff starts to slip in when we start comparing ourselves to other people. Why do we compare? Because it's easier to have value and feel value in ourselves when we pull ourselves up and push others down. And you want to know who the worst group is at comparison? It's parents. It goes something like this. Uh, Babe, I know we're not perfect parents, but Billy and Debbie's kids, if they don't do something, I mean, those kids are they're going to end up in prison. That's how we are. No offense, Billy and Debbie. I know your kids, right? He's probably saying, yeah, you're right. It's comparison, though. And maybe that's the thing in your life that you are struggling with when it comes to spiritual pride, that you're constantly comparing yourselves to other people, what they have that you don't have, or what you have that they don't have. Or maybe it's fault finding. Maybe it's a critical or a harsh spirit. Maybe it's that you want attention in your life. But whatever it is, spiritual pride is dangerous. And ultimately, here's the problem with spiritual pride. When we're full of ourselves, there is no room for God. When we're full of ourselves, there is no room for God to do his thing. I mean, look at the Pharisees' prayer. I got it together. I'm better than everybody else. There's no room for God in that. So Jesus shows us a better way in verse 13. And he moves to the tax collector. And he says this in verse 13, but the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. God, have mercy on me. Don't give me justice. Don't give me what I deserve. Have mercy on me. And you know why he prayed that? Because he understands one thing, and that's this. If God doesn't intervene in his story, then he's hopeless. His situation is hopeless. Because there was a way for him to be made right under the law as a tax collector, and it was this. If you wanted to be made right under the law, you had to pay back every single penny that you had taken, plus 20% of what you had taken. And here's this tax collector. Who could do that? Rome's got the money. He's got the money he charged above. How is he ever going to pay back every penny plus 20%? Who could do that? His situation was hopeless. And he knew that if God didn't intervene, then he was hopeless. And this is what Jesus says about that prayer that he prayed in the next verse. He says, I tell you that this man, the tax collector, this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. You see, when we're full of ourselves, there is no room for God. But when we empty ourselves, when we humble ourselves, like this tax collector, when we empty ourselves, we're in the perfect position to be filled by God's grace. We're in the perfect position to be filled by God's grace. And here's why that's good news. Because some of you walked into church today, or you're watching online, and you have already been humbled by a situation. Something's happening in your life that has really humbled you. Maybe it's a choice that you made, a decision that you made, and now you have been humbled by it. Maybe it's a life situation, but it's humbled you. And you're here today, and you're saying what the tax collector was saying. God, if you don't intervene, then it's just hopeless. I don't have a chance without you. And Jesus, who wants to intervene in your life, he wants to bring you hope. He wants to bring you forgiveness. All we have to do is empty ourselves, and then we are put in the perfect position to be filled by God's grace and experience the forgiveness that this tax collector experienced. When we empty ourselves, we're in the perfect position to be filled by God's grace. One final thought, though, and that's this. When we empty ourselves, we're also in the perfect position to be used by God. The last part of the verse says this, for all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, how do we empty ourselves before God so that he can use us? Well, there's so many different ways that God can choose to do that. Last week we talked about confession. We talked about how important it is to not hide our sin, but to confess it so that we can drop the mask and we can be real We can be authentic. Serving others. That's another way of being humble. When you came in, maybe you saw our friends from Core Love out in there. I hope you'll stop by and visit with John and Tracy and Robbie and the guys. And when you go by, when you see Robbie, say, Robbie, thank you for saving Tim Seipel's life. Say that. Because if he hadn't got, if he didn't have his medical knowledge, that bad coconut milk would have killed Tim Seipel right there in Haiti, I'll tell you. Sometimes serving like that, going on a trip like that, in a country like that, is humbling, and it's emptying yourself. Just make sure that when you come back, you don't say, well, there's not too many people who would go to Haiti like I did. What's that? Now you've shot in the other direction. Here's what I would tell you. If you're facing something, a decision, or praying about something and want to humble yourselves, I'm going to put a question up on the screen, just a really simple question that you can ask yourself, and that's this. Is this about my glory, or is this about God's glory? Simple question, but the answer is very important. You see, if God's gifted you to communicate or to teach, many of you he has, the way you use it is one of those two ways. It's either about your glory or it's about God's glory. If you're a musicians, we struggle with this, don't we? Is my singing, is my playing about my glory, or is it about God's glory? And whatever God's gifted you to do, or whatever opportunity he's given you to serve, is this about my glory? Is this about his glory? Is this so people will see me serving, or is this so that God will be glorified by my serving? It's a simple question, but it's a really tough question to answer, because it keeps us from being like this Pharisee who wanted everyone to see what he did, rather than the tax collector who humbly said, have mercy on me. So, spiritual pride, it's seeing ourselves, seeing yourself, seeing myself as a gift to God rather than a gift from God. Have you been wondering what this onion's doing up here? I thought you probably were. Some of you are going like, you couldn't pay attention to anything I said because you're wondering about this onion, right? Well, when it comes to pride, I've heard it said that the way God deals with pride in our lives is that sometimes you can compare it to an onion. In that, in order to get to what the good stuff is that you want to eat, you got to peel away the bad stuff, right? So sometimes we have to let God peel away the things in our lives that are pride. Maybe it's that thing about comparing ourselves to others. And God just has to peel that off before we can get to the next step. And once he does that and we deal with it, then maybe there's something else that he deals with in our lives. Maybe it's that critical spirit that we have of other people, because we don't want to think that we think this, but we do think that we're better than them. And God has to peel that away in order to get to the good stuff. Maybe it's that problem of attention seeking. You want everybody to see what you drive, everybody to see where you live, everybody to see what you wear. And God has to peel that away to get to what really is important. You willing to do that this morning? Are you willing to say, God, have mercy on me? Don't give me what I deserve. Give me grace. And the way we do that is just like this tax collector. We have to empty ourselves. Because when we're full of ourselves, there's no room for God. But if we empty ourselves, we're in a perfect position to not only be filled with his grace, but also for him to use us. I love the song that we sang earlier, especially that part that says, with everything. With everything. We shout forth your praise. With everything. With everything. we shout forth your glory. It's about him, not about me.